"You think you can play chess?" she sneered, not even looking up from her polished mahogany board as she moved a pawn like it was an afterthought. "Beat me, and I'll marry you." Her voice was silk wrapped around a dagger, playful on the surface, but dipped in arrogance, so thick it almost echoed. The man across from her didn't laugh. He didn't flinch. He just looked at her with calm, gray-green eyes and replied, "My name is Owen, and I play for real." She raised an eyebrow, amused by his gall. Just a janitor in overalls, challenging the queen of a corporate empire. What followed wasn't a game. It was an execution. His fingers danced over the board like he was channeling something ancient and cold and precise. She went from condescending smiles to clenching fists in a matter of minutes. 21 moves later, her king lay tipped on its side, and in the silence that followed, all she could hear was the sound of her own pride crumbling. What she didn't know, what no one in that gleaming glass tower knew, was that the man she just tried to humiliate had once crushed national champions before he disappeared from the spotlight. On that board, she never stood a chance. The 42nd floor conference room always smelled faintly of ambition and expensive furniture polish. Eleanor Vance sat alone near the wide glass windows, bathed in the golden wash of the late evening sun, silently studying the ebony in every chessboard that once belonged to her father. Each carved piece was a fragment of memory, his hands teaching hers, his voice explaining every strategic nuance like it held the key to the world. But tonight, chess wasn't about nostalgia. It was a meditation, a refuge, a small square battlefield where things still made sense. In business, chaos reigned in whispers and power plays. On the board, the rules were sacred. At 35, Eleanor had everything people claimed to want: respect, money, control. She had built a modest consulting firm into a multinational empire and crushed every doubt along the way. But none of it had made her feel less alone. Love had proven to be her blind spot. Every relationship twisted by power dynamics. Every man either intimidated by her success or obsessed with taming her. Eventually, she stopped playing altogether. At least in real life. She didn't see him at first, just the quiet squeak of wheels as the janitor pushed his cart into the conference room. Uninvited but invisible in that way people like him always were. Tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in navy blue overalls. He moved with a quiet purpose, his presence barely registering. Until it did, his gaze lingered on the chessboard, not out of idle curiosity, but with the kind of focused attention that suggested he saw more than just a rich woman's distraction. Eleanor noticed, and for reasons she wouldn't admit, loneliness, ego, or sheer boredom. She issued the challenge. Flippant, cruel, a test she thought she couldn't possibly lose. He accepted without hesitation, and something in the air shifted. His name was Owen, and his eyes weren't the dull, defeated kind she expected from a man in his position. No, there's something calculating there. Controlled. The same kind of look she'd seen in high-level negotiations. Right before someone made a move that shattered everything. She should have seen the warning signs. But she didn't. What Eleanor didn't know was that Owen Davies had once been the future of American chess. A national prodigy. Tournament darling. His rise had been meteoric. Until life, as it often does, struck him down with something that couldn't be calculated or countered. First, Olivia, his wife, breast cancer at 29. Then Lily, his daughter, severe asthma that turned nighttime into a battleground of breath and panic. The trophies and rankings vanished beneath hospital bills and late-night pharmacy runs. So Owen walked away from the spotlight, from the circuit, from everything. He took a job that came with health insurance and a steady paycheck, cleaning offices for $12 an hour, trading nights and rooks for vacuums and bleach. Every night, he moved quietly through the glass towers of Ridgeport's financial district like a ghost of his former self, carrying his brilliance in silence. Most people never looked twice, but when he saw Eleanor's board, her formation, her sloppy queen's gambit, the way she held the bishop like a weapon. He recognized something, not just the strategy, the hunger beneath it, the loneliness masked by performance. That night, after he walked away from the checkmate and left her staring at the board in stunned silence, Eleanor couldn't stop thinking about him. Not just the game, but the man behind the moves. There was a grace in the way he played, something almost poetic in how he dismantled her position. Precise, controlled, yet never cruel. It wasn't about proving her wrong. It was about playing right. She tried to shake it off, but the image stayed with her. His calm, his clarity, the quiet confidence that refused to bend to her status. The next day, when her assistant mentioned needing to update the building's maintenance roster, Eleanor found herself leaning over her keyboard, typing his name into the HR database under the pretense of due diligence. What she found stunned her. Former professional chess player, national rating, 2,437, nearly grandmaster status. A career pause in its prime, the abrupt ending explained by a death certificate and a dependent child. She read the lines of his history like scripture, the sacrifice, the silence, the staggering trade between genius and love. And suddenly, her world didn't feel so well-ordered anymore. She thought she understood sacrifice, long nights, ruthless decisions, the pressure of carrying an empire built on a father's name. But Owen had given up something pure. He had chosen invisibility so his daughter could breathe. That truth gnawed at her, slowly unraveling the narrative she'd wrapped around herself for years. That ambition was always worth the price. The feelings were distractions. That strength meant never needing anyone. Now, the janitor she tried to turn into a punchline had become a question mark she couldn't ignore. Who else had she overlooked? Who else had she misjudged? The next time she saw him, she didn't make a joke. She didn't try to dominate the moment. She just watched as he cleaned the floor near the executive lounge with the same quiet precision he brought to the board. And when their eyes met, something passed between them. A recognition of intellect, of damage, of two people playing very different games, each hiding in plain sight, each waiting for the next move. The match was no longer over. It was just beginning. The second game wasn't planned, not officially, but when Eleanor saw him walking past the empty break room near the executive suite, something compelled her to speak. "Do you always play that well?" she asked, half curious, half defensive. Owen paused, hands resting lightly on the card handle. "Only when it matters." That answer shouldn't have hit her as hard as it did, but it landed like a challenge. Within minutes, they were back in the conference room, resetting the same board she'd once ruled like a throne. This time, she didn't smirk. She studied him, watched how his fingers touched the pieces, not possessively, but with reverence, as if they were more than tools. They were old friends. When he played his first move, a quiet E4, she felt her spine straighten. He wasn't showing off. He wasn't coasting. He was serious. And that terrified her more than she expected. She mirrored with C5, a Sicilian response. Aggressive, tactical. He met it with the kind of calm confidence that made her question whether she was starting a chess game or stepping into something much deeper. By the fourth move, she was already sweating. Internally, of course. Her posture remained rigid, expression unreadable, but inside her mind, alarms were beginning to flash. Owen's strategy wasn't flashy or aggressive. It was deliberate, elegant, and quietly relentless. Every move he made had a ripple effect, subtly shifting the momentum of the game in his favor. He didn't waste pieces. He didn't bluff. He simply advanced, layer by layer, until her defenses began to fold like thin paper. She tried to counter, launching a premature bishop exchange, hoping to disrupt his center. He responded with knight, repositioning so fluid and efficient. It felt like he had anticipated her 2 turns in advance. Her breathing grew shallow, not from panic, yet, but from the dawning realization that she wasn't just playing against a skilled opponent. She was being studied, dismantled. Every strength she thought she had was being turned against her. And through it all, Owen remained calm. Not smug, not superior, just present. Like this wasn't about winning or losing. It was about revealing the truth between the moves. By the 10th move, Eleanor knew she was in trouble. Her usual rhythm, steady, assertive, commanding, had unraveled into reactive gestures. She was chasing him, not leading. For someone who'd built her entire career on controlling the boardroom, it was a jarring shift. Owen, on the other hand, seemed to breathe and sync with the game. Each turn felt like it was drawn from a private script only he could see. A narrative unfolding with surgical grace. She reached for her queen, hesitated, then redirected toward a safer move. That half-second of doubt didn't go unnoticed. "You always play defensively when you're unsure," he murmured, eyes still fixed on the board. Her head snapped up. The line between game and confrontation had just vanished. "You analyzing me now?" she asked, sharper than intended. "Just the moves," he said evenly, but something in his tone, something gentle, almost kind, cut through her pride. This wasn't just a game anymore. It was exposure, not just of skill but of psyche. And as her castle crumbled piece by piece, she began to wonder if this man had walked in to clean the floor, or to show her the parts of herself she'd kept buried under layers of control. Move 15 arrived like a quiet storm. Eleanor tried to retreat her queen's side knight, hoping to reset the tempo. But Owen responded with a pin that sliced into her defense like a scalpel. She stared at the board, her thoughts racing, trying to find a countermove that wouldn't collapse the entire structure. None appeared. She glanced up, only to find Owen watching her. Not gloating, not challenging, but observing. His expression carried the quiet intensity of someone who had seen collapse before and understood its weight. "Check," he said softly, his knight slipping into a diagonal that hadn't existed a heartbeat ago. She shifted her king. Another move. Check. This time from a rook she'd forgotten to consider, tucked behind a wall of pawns. Her breath caught. She could feel it now. Her empire on the board falling, just as her mental armor cracked. And then, like a final echo in a collapsing chamber, his voice, "Checkmate. 21 moves." The exact number it took for her to go from superior to stunned, from composed to cracked. He sat back without a smile. Just silence. Respectful. Unapologetic. She had been defeated, utterly and beautifully. The Ivory King lay toppled on the board, its fall quiet but deafening. Eleanor stared at it, hands motionless, the weight of her own surrender pulsing through her fingertips. She wanted to speak, to salvage her pride, to rationalize, to make light of the outcome. But nothing came. Owen began resetting the pieces with the same reverence he had shown from the beginning. No victory dance, no smug remarks, just quiet, precise movements, as if the win wasn't meant to impress anyone. Finally, she found her voice brittle and sharp. "You hustle me." It wasn't an accusation. It was a confession of her own arrogance, of her blind assumptions. He looked up calm as ever. "I never said I couldn't play. You assumed that when you saw what I do for a living." The words hit harder than the checkmate. She'd reduced him to a uniform, to a job title, and he'd answered not with anger, but with brilliance. She'd just been outplayed, and somehow, in a lingering silence between them, it felt like the most honest thing that had happened to her in years. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She kept seeing the board, her exposed king, his untouched pawns, the quiet way he'd reset everything, as if what happened between them didn't shake the ground beneath her feet. She told herself it was curiosity, maybe professional intrigue, but at 2:13 a.m., where she logged into the company's internal system and searched his name, she knew better. It wasn't just the game. It was him, the man behind the silence. The file came up easily, standard HR form. Nothing unusual at first glance. Age, 39. Position, facilities maintenance. Status, widowed. One dependent. No disciplinary records. Clean driving history. Then, near the bottom, a single line that made her pulse spike. Previous occupation, professional chess player. Her fingers hovered, then moved faster. She opened a new tab, pulled up the National Chess Federation database, and typed in his name, Owen Davies. When the result loaded, she leaned back in her chair, breath catching in her throat. Rating, 2,437. A prodigy, a near master. She wasn't just beaten, she was dismantled by someone who'd once played among the best in the world and disappeared without a trace. She dug deeper, chasing details like breadcrumbs through digital history. Tournament record from the late 90s and early 2000s lit up her screen. Owen Davies, age 16, taking down seasoned players with the precision of a surgeon and the imagination of a poet. Articles described him as fearless, almost unnerving in his composure, a tactical machine wrapped in quiet charisma. Photographs showed a boy with fire in his eyes and a confidence that burned through the frame. Her breath caught as she recognized the familiar shape of his jaw. His eyes, still the same, only now dulled by years of something heavier. Forum threads speculated about why he vanished. Some said burnout, others guessed scandal, but the truth revealed itself in a public record buried beneath medical data. Olivia Elizabeth Davies, age 29, deceased. Cause, metastatic breast cancer. Survived by husband Owen and daughter Lily. The timeline matched perfectly. Just as his career was reaching its apex, he vanished from the spotlight to care for a dying wife and a toddler daughter. It wasn't a fall from grace. It was a choice. One Eleanor couldn't stop replaying her mind over and over again. She stared at the screen, overwhelmed not by guilt, but by awe. This wasn't a man who had failed. This was a man who had traded brilliance for survival, who had walked away from a world that worshipped him, not because he couldn't keep up, but because something more important demanded his presence. She thought about the silence in his game, the elegance of his strategy, the absence of ego in every move. It all made sense now. He wasn't playing to prove anything. He was playing like someone who had already learned the cost of winning too much. As she had dared to reduce him to a uniform and a mop, the realization gutted her. She'd spent years building empires, making decisions that affected hundreds, climbing higher and higher under the illusion that power equaled meaning. But in one night, Owen Davies had exposed something deeper, something pure. He wasn't just better at chess. He was better at life. And the more she saw of his past, the more she questioned her own. What had she ever sacrificed that hadn't come with a press release or a strategic upside? She couldn't stop staring at one particular tournament photo. Owen at 17, holding a silver trophy nearly half his size. Expression unreadable. Not triumphant, not even proud. Just focused like he was already thinking 5 moves ahead. That same focus now cleaned office floors and emptied wastebaskets, invisible to everyone except those who looked closely. And Eleanor was only just beginning to understand what she had overlooked. She pictured him in the break room, rinsing out a mop bucket while her senior partners passed by, never once acknowledging his presence. And yet, this man once stood at the edge of international greatness. How had no one seen him? How had she? Maybe because they weren't looking. Maybe because people like her weren't trained to see genius without credentials, brilliance without context. In her world, a man without a title was a man without weight. But Owen had disproven that in 21 moves. And now, again, with the weight of his story, it wasn't that he had lost his place in the world. He had redefined it, quietly, on his own terms. And suddenly, she wanted to know what it had cost him to make that choice, and whether he regretted it. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at the office early, but not to prepare for a meeting. She hovered near the back hallway that led to the service elevator, where the cleaning crew usually passed through unnoticed. When Owen appeared, pushing his cart like every other day, she stepped into his path without a plan. "I read about you," she said, her voice softer than she intended. He blinked, surprised but not startled. "Did you now? You were supposed to be a grandmaster," she added, searching his face for something. Anger, pride, anything. "You would have made it." He looked away for a moment, then nodded. "Probably." She waited for him to say more, to explain, but he didn't. He didn't owe her that. And, somehow, that made her respect him more. "You gave it all up," she whispered. He met her gaze. "She needed me more than the game did." It was the simplest sentence she'd ever heard, and the most profound. She stepped aside, letting him pass, her heart thudding with something she couldn't name. This man hadn't lost his crown. He'd simply stopped needing one. It happened on a Thursday evening, just past 6, when the sky above Ridgeport had turned the color of burning copper and the office tower was nearly empty. Eleanor had been reviewing merger projections in her glass-walled corner office when she heard the sound. It wasn't loud, just a voice, strained, tight with panic, echoing faintly from the underground parking garage. She froze, instinct clashing with routine, but something in that voice cut through everything. She grabbed her phone and her coat and followed the sound. What she found at the far end of the garage stopped her cold. Owen was on his knees beside a small girl, his daughter, her tiny chest heaving violently as she struggled to breathe. Her lips were tinged blue, her eyes wide with that unmistakable terror of someone drowning in plain air. "Lily, baby, just hang on," Owen whispered, his voice breaking despite his best effort to stay calm. One arm cradled her, the other fumbling with an inhaler that clearly wasn't doing enough. Eleanor dropped her briefcase without thinking. This wasn't chess. This wasn't business. This was life unraveling, second by second. Without hesitation, Eleanor pulled out her phone and dialed emergency services, her voice slicing through the panic like a scalpel. "This is Eleanor Vance. We need an ambulance at Vance Tower, basement level. Pediatric respiratory emergency. I'm authorizing rooftop access for medical transport if necessary." She knelt beside Owen, her tailored coat brushing the oil-stained concrete, and gently touched his arm. "They're on the way. Stay with her." He looked up, and for the first time since she'd known him, his composure cracked. Pure fear stared back at her, raw, human, utterly unguarded. Not for himself, for his child. "She's had attacks before," he said, voice hoarse. But this one, she couldn't even finish dinner. She just started gasping. Lily whimpered, clinging to him, eyes fluttering. Eleanor instinctively reached out, placing a steadying hand on the girl's back, unsure if it helped but unable to do nothing. The helplessness was suffocating. She could move markets with a phone call, dissolve entire divisions overnight, but in this moment, all her power meant nothing. She couldn't outmaneuver this. She could only wait and hope. The ambulance arrived in under 8 minutes, though it felt like a lifetime compressed into the space between breaths. The medics moved fast. Oxygen mask, vitals, stretcher. Owen climbed in without hesitation, never letting go of Lily's hand. Eleanor didn't ask permission. She followed in her car, ignoring every red light her driver cautiously pointed out. At Ridgeport General, she bypassed reception entirely, flashing her company credentials and authorizing emergency support through her corporate health account. The nurses didn't question her. She wasn't there as a CEO tonight. She was someone who refused to stand idle. As the ER doors closed behind Owen and Lily, Eleanor was left in the sterile quiet of the family waiting lounge, the scent of antiseptic thick in the air. Her hands trembled slightly as she checked her phone for non-existent updates. Around her, other families waited, some crying, some praying. She didn't know how to sit still in this kind of uncertainty. Every part of her training had prepared her to solve problems, make decisions, control outcomes. But here, in this cold fluorescent room, she had no authority, no liberty, just hope and the echo of a child's shallow breath. When Owen finally emerged from the pediatric wing, his face was pale, eyes sunken but steadier. Eleanor stood before he could speak, the question already forming. He gave a small nod. "She's stable. Oxygen helped. They're keeping her overnight for observation, but she's okay. The relief hit her like a wave, followed by something deeper, heavier. She looked at him, this man who had once destroyed her on a chessboard with surgical elegance, now unraveling before her in quiet gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly. "You didn't have to come." She shook her head. "I could not." And she meant it. Somewhere between her desk and the hospital, something inside her had shifted. This wasn't about reputation or obligation anymore. It wasn't about righting a wrong or clearing a death. It was something else, something real. They sat together in the family lounge, not speaking at first, just breathing, just existing in the strange, quiet afterstorm. For the first time in years, Eleanor wasn't thinking about quarterly earnings or board votes. She was thinking about a little girl in a hospital bed and a man who would sacrifice anything to keep her breathing. They talked in fragments, the way people do when sleep-deprived and emotionally wrung out. Owen spoke of Lily's asthma, how it had started mild and spiraled after Olivia passed, how every cold, every shift in weather felt like Russian roulette. Eleanor listened, really listened, for perhaps the first time in years without calculating a response. She asked no performative questions, just sat with the weight of his words, letting them settle where they needed to. At some point, a nurse brought Owen a blanket and Eleanor a lukewarm cup of hospital coffee, and neither of them moved. Outside the window, the city continued, cars gliding through intersections, emails flying through servers, meetings being scheduled. But in that moment, their world had narrowed to this room, this bench, this quiet alliance formed in crisis. When Eleanor finally stood to leave, Owen looked up at her with something different in his eyes. Not gratitude, not obligation, just recognition. "You didn't have to stay," he said again, quieter this time. "I know," she replied, voice raw, "but I wanted to, and for once that was enough." In the days that followed the hospital scare, something unspoken settled between them. They didn't exchange numbers, didn't make plans, but somehow their paths kept crossing. Eleanor began lingering a little longer in the lobby during her afternoon coffee break, her reports conveniently in hand, just as Owen's shift passed through. He, in turn, started appearing more often on the executive floors, his excuse always tied to a work order or a supply restock. But it wasn't coincidence. Not really. Their conversations began simply, comments about the weather, a nod toward the news. But soon it deepened. Owen would ask her what she was reading. She'd ask how Lily was sleeping. The words came easily, naturally, without effort or pretense. Eleanor found herself laughing more, not the polite, calculated laughter she reserved for boardrooms, but something looser, real. Her assistant, Chloe, noticed first. "You're softer lately," she'd said one morning, trying to sound neutral. Eleanor had only shrugged, but inside, she knew it was true. Something in her had shifted, and though she hadn't told anyone, she found herself waiting for those accidental meetings with a quiet anticipation she couldn't quite explain. For Owen, the shift was just as startling. He had grown used to being invisible, part of the background, noticed only when something spilled or broke. But with Eleanor, he wasn't just seen, he was understood. She asked about Lily with genuine concern, not curiosity. When he spoke about chess, she didn't interrupt or redirect the conversation. She listened, and that changed everything. He found himself thinking about her at odd moments, wondering how she took her coffee, what music she played when no one else was around, whether she remembered what it was like to feel small. And yet he was cautious. He had spent years building walls to protect his daughter, his peace, his carefully structured routine. Eleanor was unpredictable, powerful, part of a world that had always seemed built to exclude men like him. But when she smiled, not the cold executive smile, but the one that reached her eyes, he felt something unfamiliar. Hope maybe, or the quiet terror that comes with letting someone close. Still, he didn't pull away. And when their conversations stretched longer, when she sat beside him instead of across from him, he stayed. Because some connections don't announce themselves. They just grow. The first time she saw Lily outside of the hospital, it was a Saturday afternoon in the park. Eleanor had gone there on impulse, needing air, something simple, something green. She didn't expect to see Owen on the bench near the playground, watching a girl in braids spin around the monkey bars with stubborn determination. But he noticed her instantly, lifted a hand in greeting, and instead of walking away, she walked toward him. "She looks better," Eleanor said, watching the girl's laughter float across the grass. "She is," Owen replied. "Good days are good. We hold on to those." He introduced them with the kind of fatherly pride that made Eleanor's chest ache. Lily was bright-eyed, curious, and charming in a way that didn't try to impress. It just was. "You're the lady from Daddy's work," she said with a matter-of-fact tone that made Eleanor smile. "You helped at the hospital." "I guess I did," Eleanor answered, crouching to Lily's height. "It's nice to meet you properly." And just like that, the circle around them expanded, no longer two, but three. And something about it felt right. Their interactions slowly bled beyond coincidence. One night, Eleanor found herself sitting on Owen's worn but clean couch, watching a movie Lily had picked out, a clumsy animated fantasy with dragons and talking frogs. She didn't care. Lily was curled beside her with a blanket, offering commentary with the fierce opinions only 8-year-olds possessed, while Owen watched from the kitchen, flipping grilled cheese with practiced ease. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't polished, but it was real, and it disarmed her more than any corporate takedown ever had. After the movie, they played chess, Eleanor and Owen on opposite sides, Lily acting as self-declared referee and rule-maker, adding whimsical changes as she pleased. Knights could jump twice, pawns could fall in love, queens wore invisible crowns. Eleanor didn't win, but she didn't mind. For once, it wasn't about control. It was about presence, about laughter, about the quiet miracle of being allowed into a world built on resilience and tenderness. She left that night with a handmade drawing Lily had slipped into her bag, a crayon version of the three of them holding hands. It didn't say family, but it didn't have to. At work, Eleanor's shift didn't go unnoticed. Her board meetings grew shorter, her tone warmer. The partners speculated. Chloe said nothing, but smiled more. Eleanor didn't care about the whispers. For the first time in years, she wasn't performing. She was living. With Owen, things were slow, careful, unspoken. There were no declarations, no formal changes. Just long conversations after Lily's bedtime, moments where their hands brushed, then lingered. And through it all, Lily watched them with quiet amusement, as if she'd known this would happen all along. Children had a way of sensing things, like when the air in a room shifts, or when someone starts showing up more, not out of obligation but choice. One night, as Eleanor helped Lily organize her scattered chess pieces into little castles, the girl looked up and said, "You make Daddy less tired." It undid her more than any compliment ever had, because it wasn't about strategy. It wasn't even about love, not yet. It was about healing, about softness returning to places hardened by grief and ambition. And neither of them said it, but they both knew. Something was beginning that neither of them had planned, but neither of them wanted to lose. The scandal didn't arrive with a warning. It landed like a slap on a Tuesday morning, tucked inside a company-wide ping. A video posted on the internal social channel by Arthur Jenkins, a junior associate whose name Eleanor barely remembered. The caption read, "When the CEO promises to marry the janitor if he beats her at chess, and he actually does it in 3 moves." Legally binding, it should have been laughable, but it wasn't. The footage, grainy, shot through the glass wall of the conference room, captured everything. Her flippant remark, his calm acceptance, the quiet intensity of the game compressed into 90 seconds of office spectacle. By noon, it had been forwarded to dozens of personal phones. Comment threads exploded, Jokes about workplace romances, bets on whether HR would intervene, whispers about favoritism and inappropriate conduct. It wasn't just gossip. It was a storm. Eleanor didn't see it until Chloe knocked gently on her door, face pale. "Miss Vance, we have a situation." And as Eleanor watched herself on screen, smirking, careless, undone, she felt the blood drain from her face. Her joke had become a meme, and her pride, once unshakable, began to crack. The fallout was immediate and ruthless. By mid-afternoon, her phone was vibrating non-stop. Board members calling with concern thinly veiled as reprimand, journalists fishing for comment, legal advisors scrambling to interpret policies that had never accounted for viral chess proposals. The HR department logged 17 internal complaints by lunch, most framed as requests for clarification about executive-employee relationships and power dynamics. Eleanor's inbox ballooned with passive-aggressive questions. Was this appropriate conduct for a leader? Should we be worried about precedent? And beneath it all was a nastier current, subtext laced with classism and sexism. Headlines practically wrote themselves. The Ice Queen Theo melting for her janitor, power, desire, and pawn play in the executive suite. She tried to stay calm, to manage, to explain it away as a joke taken out of context. But the problem was, it hadn't been. Not entirely. She had meant it to sting. She had meant to keep the upper hand. And now, the world was watching her lose it in real time. She sat at her desk, staring at her reflection in the black screen of her laptop, and for the first time in years, she didn't know what move to make next. The worst call came just after 4 p.m. from Robert Vance, her uncle and chairman of the board, whose tone carried more weight than any press headline. "Eleanor," he said without preamble, "what the hell is this?" She braced herself. It was a joke, a moment taken out of context. "It doesn't look like a joke," he snapped. "It looks like an executive compromising the dignity of this company." She clenched her jaw, hearing not just the fury of a chairman, but the sharp disappointment of family. "You've built this company on discipline, Eleanor, on control, and now this." His words echoed louder than the online commentary, not because of their content, but because she feared he might be right, that she had, in one reckless moment, compromised everything she'd built, not because of what she felt, but because of how she'd let it surface. That night, she rode the elevator down alone, the hum of fluorescent lights louder than usual. When the doors opened on the service level, Owen was there, cleaning, focused, unaware, until she stepped in front of him, shoulders stiff, and asked the question that had been burning since morning. "Did you know someone was recording us?" Owen looked up slowly, his face unreadable at first, but when he saw the fire behind her eyes, something in him shifted. "No," he said simply, "I didn't know anyone was recording." His tone was calm, almost resigned, but Eleanor wasn't done. "Did you plan this?" she demanded. "Was this your angle all along? Get close. Make me look like a fool. And what? Leverage it into a better job." His jaw tightened, not with anger but with hurt. "You really think I'd use my daughter's illness, my job, all of this, for promotion? I don't know what to think anymore," she snapped, her voice rising. "You embarrass me, in front of the whole company." "I beat you," he replied quietly. "That's all I did." The words struck her like ice. She had come to confront him, to demand answers, but now she heard herself, defensive, accusatory. Exactly the kind of executive who treated people like pieces on a board. "Right," she said bitterly. The noble janitor, outplaying the CEO. What a story. Owen's expression didn't change, but his eyes dimmed just slightly. "I thought you were different," he said softly. "But maybe I was wrong." The elevator doors opened behind him, and without another word, Owen stepped inside, the hum of the machine swallowing him whole. Eleanor stood frozen in the hallway, his final words reverberating in the silence like a clock ticking down. She'd spent her entire adult life mastering the game, of business, of strategy, of power. But this wasn't a boardroom. There were no quarterly projections here, just a man who had once trusted her, and a silence she didn't know how to fix. The next few days blurred. The video was pulled from the company's servers, but it was too late. It had already leaked. Gossip blogs picked it up. Business sites speculated about her leadership. The board scheduled a review. She buried herself in spreadsheets, policies, shareholder calls, but nothing quieted the noise. She didn't see Owen again, not in the halls, not near the elevator, not even in the service logs. It was as if the entire fragile thread that had tied their worlds together had been cut clean, and every time she passed the empty conference room where it all began, she could still see the tipped king, the quiet defeat, and a man who had walked away not because he wanted it, but because she'd left him no choice. The call came 3 days later, just after lunch, when Eleanor was in the middle of reviewing a proposal that no longer held her attention. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered without thinking. "Eleanor Vance," she said automatically. On the other end, silence. Then Owen's voice, tight, raw. "Is your insurance authorization still valid?" Her breath caught. "Yes." "Why? What happened?" "Lily's having another attack." "Bad. I'm at Ridgeport General, but the triage wait is over 90 minutes. Eleanor was already on her feet, grabbing her keys. "Text me what room. I'm on my way." She didn't wait for a reply. Within minutes, she was in her car, navigating downtown traffic with the precision of a woman who knew exactly where she needed to be. And why? She burst into the ER like she owned the place, because in that moment, she didn't care how it looked. All that mattered was the little girl gasping for air. She found Owen hunched beside Lily's stretcher, holding her hand, eyes glazed with panic and sleeplessness. The sight of him, strong, silent, breaking, cut deeper than any boardroom betrayal ever had. Eleanor didn't speak. She just moved, presenting credentials, authorizing emergency clearance, escalating Lily's case with the kind of efficiency that usually closed million-dollar deals. Within minutes, a pediatric team arrived, and Lily was rushed behind closed doors, leaving Owen and Eleanor alone in the sterile hallway. He didn't thank her. He didn't need to. The look he gave her, equal parts exhaustion, gratitude, and sorrow, said everything. They waited in silence, side by side on the cold plastic chairs, surrounded by beeping monitors and muffled cries from other rooms. Eleanor stared at her hands. She wanted to say something, an apology, a confession, anything, but the words refused to form. What could she possibly offer that wouldn't sound like another power play? Then quietly, Owen spoke. "They say she might need long-term treatments. Experimental ones. Out of state. Insurance won't cover most of it." Eleanor turned to him, instinctively reaching for solutions. "I can," but he stopped her with a look. "Don't offer money. Not tonight." She nodded, throat tight. This wasn't a problem to fix. It was a weight to carry. And for once, all she could do was carry it with him. Hours passed. Eleanor didn't leave. She sat with Owen through every delay, every vague update from nurses, every hollow moment of helplessness. When Lily was finally moved to her room, hooked up to oxygen and monitors that blinked with steady rhythm, they both exhaled for the first time all night. Owen stood at the window, arms crossed, back rigid. Eleanor watched him, realizing how much he'd aged in just a week. The lines deeper, the silence heavier. "I'm sorry," she said at last. Not strategic, not performative, just raw. "For what I said, for what I assumed, for treating you like..." She trailed off. He didn't move. "You were scared," he replied. Not unkindly. People say cruel things when they're scared. She nodded, but it didn't make it easier. "I destroyed something that mattered," she said. "I thought I was protecting myself, but I was just arrogant." He turned slowly, meeting her gaze. His eyes held no accusation, only disappointment. "I hope you were different," he said. That landed harder than anger ever could, because it wasn't about the video. It was about trust, and she'd broken it, not with strategy, but with fear. She wanted to fight it, to explain, to justify, to reclaim even a shred of the control she'd once wielded so effortlessly. But sitting in that hospital room, under the low hum of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic beep of monitors, she understood something she'd never let herself feel before. Helplessness. Not the kind that came from losing a deal or a vote. The kind that came from watching someone you care about suffer and being utterly powerless to stop it. "You're right," she whispered. "You hoped I was different. And I wasn't. I let everything I built turn me into someone I don't even recognize." Owen didn't answer. He just looked at Lily, small, pale, breathing easier now, but still fragile, still fighting. "She's getting worse," he said quietly. "More attacks. Less warning. The specialists say we need to act fast." Eleanor felt her throat tighten, not because of fear, but because she finally understood. This wasn't about guilt or redemption. It was about showing up. Not once. Not for show, but for good. "What do you need from me?" she asked. He didn't look away from his daughter. "I need you to mean it." The next afternoon, Eleanor stood outside Owen's apartment building, a modest brick complex tucked behind a city bus stop, with a paint chipped on the stairwell and the mailbox numbers peeled from the metal slots. She had no plan, no speech, just an ache in her chest that wouldn't let her stay away. Lily answered the door. She looked better, still tired but clearer-eyed, her breathing easier. "Hi, Miss Eleanor," she said with a shy smile that made something in Eleanor's ribcage loosen. "Daddy's cooking grilled cheese. Want some?" The offer was simple, pure, and unexpectedly devastating. "I'd love that," Eleanor replied. Inside, the apartment smelled like butter and old carpet, and something that felt like safety. Owen appeared in the doorway, surprised but not closed off. "You came," he said quietly. "I didn't know if you would." Eleanor stepped forward. "I didn't know if I could. But then I realized, I don't want to keep playing the wrong game." They didn't hug. They didn't cry. They just stood there in the soft quiet of something beginning again. And this time, Eleanor wasn't there to win. She was there to stay. They never defined it. There was no conversation, no line drawn in sand to say this is now something real. It just became. Eleanor started stopping by Owen's place after work, sometimes with takeout, sometimes with nothing but a tired smile. Lily would open the door like it was routine, like Eleanor had always been part of their evenings. And slowly, the routines shifted. Saturday mornings meant pancakes and cartoons. Sunday evenings meant board games in mismatched socks on the living room floor. One rainy afternoon, Eleanor sat cross-legged on the carpet, helping Lily sort through a bin of tangled chess pieces and plastic dinosaurs. "The knight can ride the T-Rex," Lily explained with full authority, "but only if the queen says it's okay." Owen was in the kitchen, watching with quiet amusement. "You're corrupting the royal structure," Eleanor teased. "I'm liberating it," Lily replied, and Eleanor laughed. Not the kind that carried stress or calculation, but the kind that opened a window inside her chest. This wasn't a game anymore. This was a life she hadn't expected and wasn't sure she deserved. But for once, she didn't question it. She just stayed. Eleanor had always lived in controlled spaces, sleek apartments with sharp lines, silent elevators, and curated silence. But Owen's home was lived in, soft at the edges. There were handprints on the fridge, crayon scribbles on the walls that had never been painted over, and a constant hum of music, laughter, or Lily's voice narrating some new imaginary saga. It disarmed her. It healed her. She found herself leaving her phone in her bag, forgetting meetings she would have once deemed urgent. The stock market could fluctuate without her for a few hours. Lily had just learned how to castle, and that was more pressing. Owen never made a declaration, but his eyes changed. Softer, less guarded. He stopped calling her Miss Vance, even when teasing. It became Eleanor, just Eleanor. And one night, as they sat on the fire escape, watching the city blur in the lights, he said, "You know, she asked me if you're going to stay forever." Eleanor didn't answer right away, but her fingers brushed his, and they stayed there. "I don't have anywhere more important to be," she finally whispered. And she meant it. One evening, Eleanor arrived with a small, gift-wrap box tucked under her arm. "It's for Lily," she said, almost nervously. Inside was a chess-set car from warm maple and deep walnut, each piece a miniature sculpture, elegant but sturdy, made to be held by small, curious hands. Lily gasped, running her fingers over the knight's mane, the queen's crown. "It's so pretty," she whispered. "Is it really mine?" "All yours," Eleanor said. "You're becoming quite the player. You deserve your own board." Owen stood behind them, arms crossed, saying nothing, but his eyes were bright, and his jaw flexed like he was holding something back. After Lily raced off to arrange the pieces her own way, combining pawns with plastic fairies and declaring the rook a spaceship, Eleanor turned to Owen. "It's not charity," she said gently. "I know," he replied. "That's why it means something." There were no decorations, just small things, a new set of pieces, a shared meal, the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath her heels. But in those small things, something steady was forming, something quiet, something she never thought she'd find in the middle of a modest apartment filled with laughter and mismatched furniture. They built something slowly, not a romance in the cinematic sense, but a rhythm, a new kind of home. Eleanor still ran a company, still wore heels and gave orders, but something in her had softened. Her edges had learned how to bend. Owen noticed it first during one of their late-night talks over chipped mugs of tea. "You laugh more," he said. "You used to hold everything so tight." She smiled. "Turns out letting go doesn't mean losing control. Just means trusting someone else to hold it with you." And in that space, neither grand nor dramatic, he reached across the table, took her hand, and simply held it. No chessboard, no strategy, just skin and warmth and the weight of everything unspoken. Lily adjusted too. She stopped calling her Miss Eleanor. One day, without warning, it just became Ellie. The first time it happened, Eleanor froze. Owen met her eyes, said nothing, but the look on his face said everything. Something had shifted, something had rooted, and it was no longer just Lily's world that Eleanor had stepped into. It was theirs. Spring came slowly to Ridgeport, painting the sidewalks in soft green and waking the city from its long gray hush. One Sunday morning, the three of them stood in front of a modest house with a crooked mailbox and a small garden patch out front. "It needs work," Owen said. Eleanor stepped forward, eyes on the porch. "It's perfect." They bought it together. Nothing extravagant, just enough space for a growing girl and two adults figuring out how to build something permanent. Lily picked the paint colors. Eleanor started learning to cook. Owen fixed things that didn't need fixing just to hear the sound of tools again. On weekends, they sat outside with coffee and chess pieces, playing long, winding games that no one kept score of. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about time, about presence, about becoming a family without ever needing to say the word. And as Lily sprawled on the porch drawing pictures of queens on dragons and knights holding flowers, Eleanor leaned back in her chair, watching the light catch Owen's smile, and realized that somewhere between a checkmate and a quiet afternoon, she had found something she didn't know she was still allowed to want. 2 months later, the backyard was filled with the kind of golden light that made everything feel like it had always belonged. The maple tree they planted together cast soft shadows across the patio, where the chessboard sat between 2 mugs of tea and a bowl of Lily's favorite grapes. The pieces were mid-game, complex, tangled, but peaceful. Owen leaned back in his chair, arms resting behind his head, a quiet ease in his posture Eleanor had rarely seen. "Your move," he said, smiling without pressure. Eleanor didn't answer right away. She was watching Lily, sprawled on a picnic blanket nearby, reading a book far too advanced for her age, pausing every few pages to glance up and offer commentary only she understood. There was no urgency here, no deadlines, no judgment, just time, the kind of time Eleanor had spent decades treating like a commodity, something to conquer. Now, she let it stretch. The position on the board wasn't critical. It could wait. She moved in knights slowly, Not for advantage, but because it felt right. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't playing to win. She was playing to stay. They played in near silence, occasionally pausing to sip tea or listen to Lily hum as she drew constellations in the grass with a stick. It had become a ritual. These Sunday games, less about competition, more about rhythm, about the familiar sounds of breath and thought. Eleanor had learned to love the way Owen thought during a match. Quiet, patient, like he was tending to something rather than dismantling it. "If I take this," she said, nudging a bishop, "I might fork your queen next." He raised an eyebrow. "You've been setting that up for 10 moves. "Possibly," she said, teasing. "Or maybe I just got lucky." He leaned forward, studying the board, his grain growing. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" They both laughed, quiet, easy. There was no tension anymore. No undercurrent of proving or hiding. Just two people sharing a space they'd built together, one move at a time. The sun moved across the sky like a silent clock, and neither of them noticed. Because here, in this moment, they already had everything they needed. At one point, Lily looked up from her book and walked over, studying the board with a thoughtful frown. "You're both playing too slow," she declared. "The pawns are getting bored." Eleanor laughed, motioning for her to sit between them. "You think you can do better?" Lily nodded confidently and moved a piece with zero regard for the position. "Now it's more exciting." Owen pretended to gasp. "You just sacrificed my queen." "She wanted to go on an adventure," Lily replied. Eleanor exchanged a glance with Owen, and for a beat, time stilled. In Lily's world, chess was still a story. Queens had dreams. Pawns had families. Games weren't battles. They were journeys. And maybe that was the lesson they both needed. Winning wasn't a point. It never had been. Connection was. Presence. The moments in between moves. Lily leaned against Eleanor's side, warm and solid, and whispered, "You're really good at this." "Chess?" Eleanor asked. "No, Lady Blave. Being here." And just like that, something inside her, something that had once been frozen and armored, finally, truly melted as the sun dipped lower, casting long amber streaks across the lawn. Eleanor stood to clear the dishes. Owen joined her, taking the mugs from her hands, their fingers brushing in the quietest kind of understanding. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "The tournaments, the spotlight." He thought for a moment. "Sometimes, but not the noise, not the pressure to always be extraordinary." He looked at her, voice lower. "This feels better, more real." She nodded, understanding in a way only someone who'd spent years being extraordinary could. "I used to think the world only respected winners," she said, "that you had to dominate, or you'd disappear." "You don't disappear," he said gently. "You just come home." The words sat between them, not grand, not rehearsed, just true. And in the stillness that followed, Eleanor realized something else. She didn't want more. Not a bigger house, not a promotion, not another victory to chase. She wanted this, a slower rhythm, a smaller circle, a life where love didn't need to be proven, only shared. As twilight settled and the first stars began to blink through the fading blue, Lily pointed at the sky. "That one's mine," she said, grinning. "The bright one near the tree." Eleanor looked up, then down at the chessboard still resting between them, unfinished like so much of life, and yet somehow complete. She reached across the board, gently taking Owen's hand, fingers interlacing like a promise made without words. "Do you think," she asked softly, "we ever really win at anything?" Owen glanced at Lily, now curled up on the blanket, half asleep with her book across her chest. "I think," he said, "we win when we choose the right game." They didn't kiss. They didn't declare anything. They just sat there, holding hands with a child between them and a chessboard in front of them, and a life stretching quietly ahead, complicated, unfinished, and deeply, deeply theirs. And somewhere in the soft rustle of leaves and the gentle clink of chess pieces, the truth settled like dust on the patio. The game that mattered most had nothing to do with kings or queens, and everything to do with showing up, one move at a time.